It's my honor to introduce Dr. Pascal Bokar Thiam. He's a professor at the University of San Francisco and the author of From Timbuktu to the Mississippi Delta, How the West African Standards of Aesthetics Shaped the Music of the Delta Blues. He's also the owner of the Savannah Jazz Club in San Carlos. So please give him a warm welcome to Google.
Thank you, Max. I hope this is working. And thank you for spending a few minutes with me, and we're delighted to be here at Google. I was asked to come and talk about this book that I wrote a couple of years ago. And I wrote it because I teach a course entitled Jazz Culture and Social Justice. And in the teaching of this book, I found out that whenever we were talking about American music and this American art form that we call jazz, all the books talked about 1865 New Orleans, moving forward. I was like, well, that's really interesting, because what happens before 1865? Well, what happens before 1865 is documented in the libraries or the history departments of Harvard University, in the history departments of La Sorbonne in Paris, or in Oxford in England. But somehow we never apply that knowledge of history to what it did and to what it contributed to American music. And so I was born in Paris, and I thought I was French. And I found out that my father was from a country named Senegal, and he was part of the first generation of West Africans who had received a scholarship to go study in Paris, which is where I met my mother. And we went back to a city called Ségou. And Ségou is in the center of Mali, and it's also the place which is famous for the instrument that you see behind me. This is called the kora in Malinke. And kora, by the way, means singing in Malinke. And the people interested in etymology will tell you that it's the same word in Greek, which is where the term choral comes from. That instrument is extremely old. So I grew up in Mali, and I kept listening to music coming from the United States. And it was really puzzling, because I was trying to figure out how we got to this.
You got it. I know you got soul. Hey, if you did, you wouldn't be in here. I know you got soul. If you did, you wouldn't be in here. I know you got soul. If you did, you wouldn't shake that thing. Hit me with the beat. Hey. Because it makes me sing. I know you got soul. Hey.
And I was like, wow, this music was making the entire planet dance. And I was like, where does it come from, and how do we get to that? And I really couldn't find out, except that my dad said, well, you know, Africans were taken to the United States. I was another kid. I said, Africans were taken to the United States. I'd say, why? And he said, well, when you get a little older, you'll study it. I was like, huh, interesting. so, in the process of my studies, I was looking at the demographics and I was looking at the history. And I'm looking at the United States, a majority population of European descent, African American representing about 10% of their population, the largest ethnic group in the United States being of German descent, which is why the country as a whole is Baptist from the Martin Luther School. I was like, I ended up studying classical music in a French conservatory, so it was very academic and they know exactly how the music works. The oldest recorded music in Europe is what we call the Baroque music. And I was listening.
Hey, if you think you ain't dead yet, I know you got the feeling.
And I was like, that cannot possibly translate. This cannot possibly come from this. So where does this music come from? What are the foundation of this music? Where are its roots? And how come I can't find it in the books? And so I looked around, then I studied a little bit more, and I found out that that between 1515 and 1888, we brought in to the southern part of the United States, between North and South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, an excess of 8 million West Africans. West Africans. 99% of African Americans, I found out, are from the west part of the continent. They're not from the north, and not from the east, and not from the south. They come out of the west. If you go to St. Augustine, Florida, there's a plaque that says, first Africans arrived. It says 1550, was recorded by the Spaniards. And the Spaniards acknowledged that the French were there with Africans before them. 1860 is when the US government sends back, is recorded as sending back a ship called the Clotilda in Mobile, Alabama. That's the first archives of the US government taking. And I started thinking, okay, because I was a developing musician. I was really interested in learning to play jazz, and I was amazed by the complexity of that art form. Jazz was very complex. My dad used to play those records all the time, and I really didn't like them very much. I like James Brown. By the way, the gentleman that you heard before that was singing, I Got Soul, I Know You Got Soul, that's Bobby Bird. He's the one who discovered James Brown. And James Brown was his band as a vocalist and a keyboard player. And I found out that the concentration of Africans in the southern colonies, in some cases, was 4-1. There was a majority population. 1515 to 1888, that's a long time. West Africans come every day, every week, every month, and every year. It is not as if they just came and then it stopped. No. They kept coming. And they kept coming with their songs, with their music, with their instruments, with their sense of religion. If you go to Louisiana, in some parts, when it's really dark, they talk about voodoo. Be careful. The voodoo religion exists in Ghana, in Togo, in Benin. And so I found out that the greatest concentration of Africans was actually in the Mississippi Delta. And in the Mississippi Delta emanates a popular form that at the beginning of the 20th century we're going to call the Delta Blues. And I started to listen to a gentleman by the name of Son House. And if you're interested in the roots and the origin of blues, you have to go to Sonhouse, Sonhouse. He's a giant in that art form. And when I was listening to this,
down south when you do anything that's wrong. Down south when you do anything that's wrong. Down south when you do anything that's wrong. They'll sure put you down on the county farm. Put you down on the man called Captain Jack. Put you on a man called Captain Jack. Put you on the man called.
and I said, wow. I listened to that. I said, that's the music of the Delta. And when I heard that, I knew it had nothing to do with Baroque music. It sounded a lot like this.
Bali, daga daga, simalanyo ikai daga onamiye. Hey amo, simalanyo ikai daga onamiye. Waninya be daga daga.
That's the music I was hearing at night. And I realized in the course of my studies that there are three medieval empires that are recorded in the West, in West Africa. One of them, the first one, is the Empire of Ghana, which is roughly from the 4th, 5th century until the 10th century. And I was talking to some of my colleagues, and if you look at it, it's placed right there in the north part of Senegal. It's called the Empire of Ghana. And it has nothing to do with the country of Ghana, which is a lot further south. But where there was a relationship with the country of Ghana is that Ghana was a British colony. It was the empire of the Ashantis. The British were there. They called it the Gold Coast. And Kwame Nkrumah, who was a revolutionary and a scholar, wanted to name his country, which was one of the first independent countries of the African continent, after the first recorded medieval empire of West Africa. And that's how the country got its name, Ghana. But the empire of Ghana itself was a lot further north than the country of Ghana. The second empire that comes in is the Empire of Mali, from the 10th century to the 14th century. And you can see how extended it goes, and it controls the trade routes to Europe, to the Middle East, to Asia. And at some point, Mali is the gold reserve of the Western world. It's well documented, those trade routes are very well managed, very well administered, and you have to have in place societies who know how to do this in order to have successful trade. And the third empire, I found out, was the Empire of Sorai from the 14th to the 17th century. And it grows concentrically from that. And that's probably the largest West African empire that we had. So what that told me, and if you look, there is a river here which takes its roots in Guinea that goes all the way up north to Timbuktu, which is a real city, by the way, and all the way down to the delta of Nigeria. That's how big that river is. It's the third largest river in the world. And it gives its name to two countries. There's a country of Niger here and the country of Nigeria right there. And the riverways are the place where people exchange cultural norms, exchange languages, exchange skills, exchange technologies, instrument, music, songs, lullabies. It serves the same cultural and economic process as the Mississippi-Missouri River, from the Gulf of Mexico all the way into Minneapolis, Minnesota, St. Paul, where it takes its roots. So very important riverways managed. These empires had some navies of sort to ensure that the commerce would prosper, and so forth and so on. So I started thinking, I said, well, if they could manage trade routes that successfully, and by the way, this is a time where there is no imbalance between the African continent and Europe, because there is no recorded history of European empires trying to go into Africa. They're not. Which tells you that there's a lot of respect between the kingdoms of Europe and the kingdoms of Africa. They trade, and that commerce is well documented. But with the event of the gunpowder, we are going to start seeing a shift in these relationships as a result. Okay? But I started thinking, I said, okay, so the trade, the Atlantic slave trade takes place, around 1515 with the Spanish and the Portuguese first, and then the French and the British and the Dutch later, and then the European powers they battle each other for control of that. But I said these populations come with knowledge, with music, with technology. By the way, there's no rice in the United States before the arrival of West Africans. So much so that plantation owners were looking for people from the west part between Guinea, Senegal, and Gambia who knew how to cultivate rice. And at one point before the Civil War, rice is the main economy in the Carolinas. If you look at the foods of the south of the United States, whether you go to New Orleans, okra, which you need for gumbo, comes out of West Africa. Black eyed peas, West Africa. So you have an entire culture, and the food that people eat in the south are the same food that people eat in West Africa. Because you don't move millions of people over long periods of time without bringing them with their culture. And so I started thinking, okay, in American music, what is the oldest American musical instrument? And, people started telling me, well, in my classes, I have some smart Alex who said, the voice, which is true. And then I hear the drums, which is also true. I said Native Americans were here first. Their culture has not got into the mainstream of American, because none of you can sing me a Navajo lullaby, for example. It hasn't transferred into. But America's oldest musical instrument is called the banjo. But there's not a single banjo in England. There's no banjo in Ireland. There's no banjo in Scotland. The banjo comes out of West Africa. It comes out of Mali. It is the instrument of the people. It's easy to make. It's easy to tune, because there's only about 3 strings, mostly. Afterward, we added some extra strings, but it is the instrument of the people. And it's a very, very important instrument, because that instrument allowed the West African population to reorganize a sense of cultural identity in the face of this political, economic hurricane that they encountered coming into the South and into these plantations. And so I'm going to take you to a place near Ségou, which is a place where I grew up, so that you can hear
This is Garana. I was born here. Garana is part of Do. Do is made up of 12 villages that exist since the 13th century.
Voilà. Ngoni.
That's a Ngoni. In the 13th century, only the great warriors were allowed to listen to it. The Ngoni is Mali's oldest string instrument. The jinn, the water spirits that live in the Niger, gave the Ngoni to my great-grandfather.
C'est les djinns qui ont donné à mon grand-père.
When I was about 20 years old, I went to Bamako. That was in '84. I met Toumani in '87 and we started working together. I played my first concert in Europe with him at a festival called Dranouté. Then I traveled to the USA alone to represent the Ngoni at the Banjo Folk Festival there. The banjo has its origins here. In the US, I went to a banjo museum. There I saw that the slaves that were brought from Africa built their instruments just the way we used to build them here. We used to make them with our calabash. The blacks that were brought to the US did the same thing. Later, they added a lot of machines to their banjo. We here in Africa didn't change much. We left it like it was. But still, it's the same thing. The banjo and the Ngoni are the same.
Donc nous, on n'a pas essayé de progresser beaucoup, on est toujours resté comme ça. C'est la même chose. C'est comme ça les banjos, je pense.
That's what a banjo sounds like, isn't it?
When I started thinking about the banjo, because you know I'm a guitar player and I like all forms of music where guitar is very present, and country music has a lot of great guitar players, and they also have a lot of banjo. And I started looking and I was like, how did that happen? Well, in order to understand how that works, we have to understand the chronology of the demographics in the United States. So West Africans bring the banjo in the plantations of the South. And West Africans are also in the plantation in charge of the music. And for the longest time, they are going to play the banjo. When European Americans move into the United States literally between 1790 and 1840, the first wave. The second wave is between 1850 and 1910. They find these European populations, were coming from the British Isles in particular, find on the banks of the Tennessee River these African populations who've been there for several hundred years before and play that instrument, the banjo, with these colors that we are later at the beginning of the 20th century going to call the blues. The term blues is something that the industry, with the invention of the phonograph, gave to black people's music so they could sell it. These Irish populations, Scottish populations, find these African populations, and they like what they hear. They're going to integrate the sound, first of all, the banjo, but also the sounds and the colors of the music of the Delta into their own Celtic heritage to give birth to another American form of music, which is extremely popular outside of the coast, called bluegrass. And you need that instrument from Mali in order to have good bluegrass. Otherwise, you might have something and it will be nice, but that will be bluegrass. You need that instrument. The banjo is even more important in terms of aesthetics because the syncopation, the rhythmic syncopation of the banjo, you know, when it goes like like this, that's what Africans are going to translate when the missionaries in the 1650s brings them Christianity and the piano. The syncopations of the banjo are going to be translated on the piano, on the left hand of the piano, to give America a new form of music that we call ragtime. So it's interesting to see how the transfers of standard of aesthetics in music have applied and over time have developed into the United States several forms of music who have identity markers that gives this nation its own sense of cultural significance. But it comes from this marriage over time of this West African culture, which you hear later on in the music of Bobby Brown or James Brown or Muddy Waters or Louis Armstrong. And so I started thinking, because when I, growing up in Africa, I found out that Americans are the only people on the face of the planet who clap on 2 and 4. And I mean by that when you listen to music, you're listening for, it's called a norm, you're listening for that space where you're supposed to clap. And sometimes you're not in the right spot and you rectify real quick because you don't want your friends to think you're square. And it's not intuitive. It is something that you have to learn. It's part of culture. So if you grow up in the Baptist church and you hear, everybody clapping, you're like, okay, this is where it is. But if you don't grow up in the Baptist church, everybody might be on that beat and you on the other one. And I said, why are they beating? Because Europeans use 1 as their reference, their metric reference of rhythm. So Europeans clap on 1. Africans also clap on 1, but for different reasons. But so why are African Americans who started clapping on 2 and 4 not on 1? So the reason for that is because I found out that when these Africans came here and they started being on that wood, which is where the term rap comes from, things would happen. The store porch would catch fire, slaves would run away, somebody get poisoned. So very quickly in North America, in the plantations of the South, plantation owners took the drums away from them. That's why in American music, unlike South American music or Central American music, it's very hard to hear even the sound of percussion. I think we only hear in mainstream American music the sound of percussion around the 60s, when there is a resurgence of a national sense of pride with respect to Africa in the music of Motown. I think Marvin Gaye, we hear some percussion. I think in the music of Donny Hathaway, we hear some percussions. But very quickly after the 70s, and certainly by the time the 80s, that ethnicity of sound is relegated to, it's taken over by the computer and by the synthesizer. So in my studies, I started looking and I said, you know, there's got to be there's a fundamental reason why Americans as a whole, why African Americans drove an entire nation to clap on 2 and 4. Because when I would take Africans to a jazz club, and they would listen to that double bass going, you know, and African Americans would, and then they would look at the Africans who were here, and the African Americans would look at these African population and say, why are they on the wrong beat? Well, we know they have rhythm, so that can't be it. Well, what happens is that when Africans are listening to sound, the subdivision of time is always ternary, meaning that they're subdivided by 3. So that when they're hearing the bass going, they're actually hearing, that's what, which is where that notion of swing comes from. Ellington said it don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing. But that's what he's referring to. And I started looking at the West African rhythms in general, and particularly the rhythms of Mali. And 99% of the West African rhythms are sequentially created. That's what technically they call that polyrhythm. But they really are sequences. And what happens is that when you listen to these rhythms, and we're going to do a little exercise together, you can hear these rhythms go like this. Do, 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 ah, do, ah, do, do, ah, do, ah. And if you put that in the context of 4 beats per measure, which is what the missionaries in 1650, 1660 brought to Africans in the plantations, and you're starting to do, 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 do. So 1, you're going to do this with me. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So keep doing it. 3, 4. Do ah do ah ah do ah do ah do ah, and you're going to hear that the accent do ah do end up on 2 and 4. So now the pulse becomes a reference point as opposed to the 1. Africans are hearing and they think and so West Africans who were stripped of their percussion, they were stripped of the instrument, but they never lost the pulse. And so any music that was given to them, they reinserted that pulse there. So much so that when the missionaries bring Christianity, and you know they're singing the hymns of the old Church of England, the Africans are listening to the way these Europeans are singing, and they say, okay, well, we're spiritual by nature, we will embrace Christianity, and we'll sing these songs, but we're not going to sing them like that, because that's not our expression. We're going to sing it this way. And the way Africans express their music was so shockingly different from what European experience was, that they called the same hymns that they were singing at First Baptist, they called that Negro spirituals. And that right there gave you a sense that these populations from West Africa were bringing a sense of expression and a sense of delivery and a rhythmic impetus and necessity, which was so important to their own sense of identity, that it was reflected in any music that they touched. And so when you look at American music, And when I was listening to Bobby Bird, and this was labeled American music, I was like, yeah, it's uniquely American, for sure. But the aesthetics that fed that foundation could only have come from the western part of the continent, of Africa. And these rhythmic markers, which are accompanied by these colors of the blues, which, by the way, the church, in particular the Roman Catholic Church, is going to label notes of the devil and things not to play. These colors made me realize that music is an expression of cultural power. And it's really important to understand that. And as such, it is extremely difficult in the context of a majority population to accept that it is its minority population, i.e. African Americans, who gave the majority population the art form for which it is known all over the world, i.e. jazz. Because jazz is born out of the roots of the Delta, into blues, into the music of Armstrong, into the music of Ellington, into the music of Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker, into the music of Miles Davis. And the context for this was always a political context. It is European scholars, who told Americans, stop playing classical music. You have an art form of your own. You have to go on the other side of the tracks. Because we studied, Europeans had the benefit of being more experienced, being an older civilization. You have people like Ravel and Debussy, who are scholars in music. They study this music coming out of the South. And they're like, whoa. They write it down and they see the complexity of the work of Ellington and Strayhorn and King Oliver and Armstrong, and they start saying, there is something going on here. So much so that Europeans as a whole stopped playing their music. And little kids, particularly the British kids, are going to go and study this music of the South, the music of the Delta. And thus are born the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin. And even the bands from England who dealt with the history of the blues and this idea of modern sounds. There's a band called Pink Floyd. Did you know that Pink Floyd was a cult name that would tell band members whether or not you were experienced? Pink Floyd is named after two great rural blues singers of the American South. One named Pink Anderson and the other one named Floyd Council. So Europeans are so taken by this music coming out of the other side of the Atlantic that all of a sudden they forget about the music of Handel, they forget about the music of Beethoven. They delve into American music, into the roots of this music coming from the South. And that's why we got to this. Now, I want to play for you that instrument called the ngoni in a contemporary setting in West Africa.
fondant. Unana kelebi onka. Jomaya kelebi onka. Ha, amrudu alama. Niana zona malite toko.
Managonia, Abesumaya. Oh, Managonia, Abesumaya.
Amanagonia, abisuma.
When you listen to this music carefully, you can hear the swing of a jazz band. That pulse is what gave American music its unique marker. And that pulse is what Africans never lost in the evolutionary process of their journey in America. Now, some people say, well, do you have to be Africans to have that pulse? So let me tell you something. In Senegal, we have European Americans who've been there for several generations. And there's these two little blonde kids in my neighborhood who had never been to France. They grew up with us. They heard those percussions. They heard those pulses. And they would go to the traditional dance parties, and they would dance just like us. And French people coming from France would look at them and say, how come they can dance like this? So really, it's more culture than nature. It's really important to understand that. Why? Because I believe that we haven't studied enough what happens to the developmental brain of a child in his mother's womb. If you live in Africa and you hear these percussions and you hear these pulses for 9 months before you come out, when you come out, regardless of your racial makeup, you're swinging. You are swinging. Because it's ingrained. It has become part of you unknowingly. Okay. So that's my little talk for today. I want to leave some time because I'd like, if you have some questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
So earlier on, you showed a clip where the gentleman was playing like this. I can't remember the name of the instrument, the guitar.
The goody.
The goody. Yeah, there's like a banjo, and either you or him was mentioning that this was an instrument given to the warriors, right? So I'm wondering. So I play guitar in classic rock music, Led Zeppelin, that kind of era stuff, right? And of course, the guitar is often referred to as an axe. I'm wondering if there's any, in your research, you came across kind of the etymology of that use of the word axe for guitar, and if there's any kind of correlation, relationship between these warriors having this axe-like.
It's a really interesting question. It's interesting you saying that because when at the club we have jam sessions on Monday and Wednesdays, and at the jam session when the guys bring their instrument, I greet them at the door. I say, "Oh, I see you brought your weapon." So yeah, I think if you definitely can think about it as an element of representation of your power, because an instrument does nothing. It is what you do with it. I mean, everybody plays guitar, but guitar players are not the same. What you do, for example, the trumpet. The trumpet is a German instrument, But after Louis Armstrong played it, everybody wanted to play like that. It became an American instrument. So what you do with the instrument is really, this is what shocked Europeans. The piano, European instrument. But after they heard Artatum, they said, oh my God, what's going on over there in that country? It became the standard. So what humans bring, it is the sheer force of their spiritual power that makes that instrument speak. And that's really what's important. And that's why music music speaks to our common humanity well beyond race. And the reason why I'm saying this is because what I've found out, and I tell that to my students, you're only concerned about race because you can see. And in my journey, in my travels, I truly believe that race is a trick that God put on humans to see if they've developed the intelligence of the heart. Because music allows you to speak beyond vision, because you're dealing with sound wave vibration. And those are expressions of your inner. And your inner is not a function of your skin tone. That doesn't mean that race is not important. Race is important because it defines your social cultural experiences. But it's just one step out of it. I don't know if I answered the question.
I think it's really fascinating the way you talked about sort of almost an evolutionary model of music, the way different forms of music are hybridizing with each other and creating new forms which are then being mixed and picked up by other people in different countries and then brought back. Is this something, I mean, you've talked a lot about tracking that, over the last couple hundred years, but is that something you think is sort of fundamental to music, that it has that life to it?
Yeah, it's a very complex question that you ask, and I'm glad you asked it. It's hard to answer it quickly, but let me try to come to it this way. What I described in this short presentation and in my book is essentially the history and the social-cultural journey of a people over time. In the case of American music, I looked at the history of the African diaspora. That knowledge is extremely important because when I look at the history books today, there is no reference to the contributions of the west part of the African continent. And yet it is so present in our mainstream every day. Just the fact that you guys are doing that tells me you're African. You just don't know why or how come, but you are. The fact that you're playing a banjo tells me you're African. You don't know why, but you are. The fact that you're using those sounds of the blues and this tells me you're African. Regardless of your skin tone, it tells me that you are Americans, therefore that you've had that African influence. Where it becomes tragic is for young African American, particularly boys, who get into their teenage years and they rebel against the system, to have not been given the benefit of knowing that they actually come, that slavery is a bump on the journey of the nations of Africa. It is not the beginning. And most young African American kids are not taught about these empires of Ghana, the empire of Mali, the empire of Songhai, who've delineated these standards of aesthetics. So when they look back, all they see is slavery and a system. If they had the chance to be given a sense of chronological history within a context that is academically sound, then that would give them the tools to say, okay, life is hard here, but you know what? I come from great people. There's an entire continent behind me that contributed great stuff. And look what we did here in America, musically. I mean, you go to Singapore, they have jazz festival. I go to Scandinavia, they have jazz festival. You go to, that comes out of that community. Giving them that sense of historical perspective and chronology would go a long way toward giving them the tools to move forward in life and say, yeah, it's hard. It was harder for others, but we come from great stuff. We can overcome. We can contribute, and we want to contribute positively. And so that's knowing where you come from, essentially. gives you the confidence to overcome the obstacles that you are going to find being a minority in a majority population. Because, you know, one of the things that we need to understand very clearly about the friction is, okay, in the United States, the friction is black and white because that's the nature of the society. But if you look at Europe, they have minorities who've contributed enormously. For example, classical music. Every major classical musician, whether it's Mozart or whether it's Beethoven, have said, we got our ideas from the gypsies. Musically, we would go to gypsy camps to hear how they played the violin, and we'd hear those melodies and we arrange them. Then it's not black and white over there. They're all white. The gypsies are maybe a little darker, but you know what I mean? So it's frictions of minority versus majority population. And you have those frictions irrespective of skin tones. And it's really something that's important to understand, because a lot of people tend to get lost in the race issue. And the race is an issue. But the social construct and the friction of societies have to be understood beyond that. And the music tells you things about societies that the music books won't. So that when you hear an American white playing the banjo, if you have knowledge, you're like, wow, this is how that instrument from Mali came into his own expression, you know. And that, understanding that and having that perspective is what allows you to overcome, you know, social, cultural realities that are very relevant.
Behind this music is a cultural superstar. And then one other thing is when you talked about what was happening in the European music, you know, I used to sneak up and sit in your classes unregistered because I was there for the knowledge. And you introduced us to one of the Three Musketeers, who was a great musician or something. Can you talk? Because I think it kind of balances in what you're saying in terms of race.
Uh-huh.
When they asked John Coltrane, does race have anything? He said, no, race has nothing to do with it. There are people that are not of the African race that look to this music, they'll enjoy it, and they'll want to be a part of it, and some of them will contribute.
So, these are difficult questions, but you should know that this is the Archbishop of the Church of St. John Coltrane, who's here in the audience. So I'm going to, let me say this. What I have said is that African Americans created an art form in the United States that literally lifted this nation to the status of a cultural superpower. And we see that crystallization of reality in the period that we call the Harlem Renaissance. This is a time where, prior to the Harlem Renaissance, America was looking to Europe for high standards of aesthetics. People were trying to dance the way Europeans danced. People were trying to play music the way. After the Harlem Renaissance, after Armstrong, after Ellington, after Lindy Hop, all of that was gone. Americans have found a sense of identity within their culture through this art form. And Europeans may choose to dance this way, but now Lindy Hop is the way Americans dance. And you guys are young here, but you guys think you can dance. You cannot dance. Go see your grandparents. But they were dancing at a time when they didn't even have health care. And when you see what they were doing with Lindy Hop, it's amazing. In tempo, rhythm, people actually playing instruments, not computers doing beats. So, and that's why I was saying, Europe, after the Harlem Renaissance, Europe looks to the United States for direction in music, in the way in which we organize music, in the structure of composition. And that's why I tell my students, if you don't get an A at a jazz history course, we cannot give you a passport to get out of the country. Because you go to Europe and they know more about Ellington and Strayhorn and Benny Goodman and Grant Miller than anybody I can actually quiz somewhere on your campus. I can tell you that. That's how important that art form became, not just to the United States, because we're the one who actually Ah, look at it the least, but elsewhere. Because they realized, when you're a trumpet player, you hear Armstrong, you pick up that instrument, you try to play, you realize that the gap between your skill set and his are the size of the Grand Canyon. And everybody wants to get over there. And that's why this art form is so important to this nation. You know?
So you mentioned that there isn't a lot of books that talk about this history, and I was just curious if you had pointers to, like, you know, where besides your book.
Yeah.
There's other places.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So this is what happens. You know, knowledge is very compartmentalized. People who study history, who are professors of history, who have PhD in history, they know about these empires of Ghana, of Mali, of Songhai. They know those. They know the dates, they know the leaders, they know. But when it comes to the general culture, I can walk in virtually any classroom in America and ask a young African-American kid, have you ever heard of these empires from which you come from? And the answer will be no. So we have not integrated that knowledge into public education, period. Why? Because, frankly, slavery is difficult to talk about. That's why. But you can talk about that subject through the music. Because through the music, you can broach almost any subject. And through the playing of an instrument, and say, okay, we're going to do some music from the Delta Blues, they can go back and now listen to these guys from Mali. They can go back. And they can seamlessly find in their own space the connection to that. But the actual academic knowledge exists perfectly. You go to La Sorbonne, they have all these books about, but in history, they never applied what that meant to the development of a superpower, because that's a little tricky. You know, people who write books have a certain sense, particularly in academia, of supremacy. So it's difficult. It's not an accident if you look at the way in which American music has functioned. In the literature, the first person baptized king of jazz is a classical musician who happens to be white, who's a very competent musician. His name is Paul Whiteman. He's the son of the great conductor of the Denver Orchestra. But he's not a jazz musician. But he loves the music. And he's going to ask a young Jewish composer to go in Harlem, listen to the music that these people are playing, and he comes back with a piece that we call Rhapsody in Blue. It's a real piece. There is not a single note of improvisation, and it's not really jazz, but it's an attempt. But in the literature today, he's the king of jazz. When African Americans hear that, they're upset. That's the generation of Armstrong, because Armstrong and King Oliver and Freddie Kepler and others before have laid out the forms for that. They decide to create a new style that they call swing. And the father of that music is an African-American chemist by the name of Fletcher Henderson, who couldn't find a job in chemistry, played the piano. And the nation should be grateful that he could not find a job in chemistry. But when you look at the way in which he articulated the instrumentation, which we call the big band, if you play big band music in America, you play Fletcher Henderson. Because he's telling you, okay, this is 5 trumpet, this is how they work. This is 4 trombone, this is how they work. This is 5 saxophone, these are the rules. And if you apply my rules, you'll have a great band. And if you don't, you won't have a great band. And Fletcher Henderson and Ellington, and these guys are out there doing it. And the new king of swing is Benny Goodman, who's an absolutely fine musician. But he's not issued from that community. So then young African Americans who were playing in the big bands were really upset. And they said, now we're going to create a music that is so complex harmonically, so fast technically, that is going to require so much mastery of your instrument. We want to see if you're going to be the king of that. And they call it bebop. And guess what? There's no king of bebop, except the two guys who created it. And the industry said, we don't want this music anymore. We're going to go towards something that's less convoluted. And they turned their sights to which was a black music called rhythm and blues. And they look at what Muddy Waters is doing, and Howlin' Wolf, and Chuck Berry, who just passed, and Little Richard, who's still alive. And they say, oh, we can deal with this. And that's how Elvis Presley comes in. His first songs were literally Little Richard songs. So he's the king of that. So there is this replication, which is a function of that friction that exists between minority groups who have to create something when they live in a majority situation in order to retain a sense of identity. And the majority who looks at what they create, and eventually, if they like it, they're going to take it over. So as long as you understand that that's a process, you can avoid paying bills to your psychologist or psychotherapist, because it's going to happen wherever that context is present. If you are green in a purple and there's 5 green for 20 purple, you're going to have that. If you have 12 blue for 30 yellow, you're going to have that. It doesn't really matter. These are the natural frictions of minorities creating art to get a sense of identity, and a majority looking at that art and deciding, yeah, we like what you're doing, and we're going to take it. Soul music. You know, soul music was defining the landscape of American music between 1970 and 75. The industry was desperate because European Americans could not work. And so they went and recruited 3 blonde guys out of Nashville, Tennessee, who really wanted to do country music. And they said, no, we want you to write this. We're going to call it disco. We're going to make a movie called Saturday Night Fever. They found the worst dancer in America. They put him on the middle of the dance floor. I mean, this is a time after which we've had Soul Train. I mean, have you seen those dancers on Soul Train? Those guys were bad. And they get, I mean, bless his soul, what's his name? John Travolta. You know that guy can dance. They put him there, and the Bee Gees became, for a period of time, you know, this expression of the majority population playing soul music, playing the music of Motown, playing the music of Marvin Gaye, playing the music. And Barry Gibbs, you know, to his credit, is an amazing songwriter. But again, this is not what they wanted to do. They wanted to play country music. The industry said, no, we need you to get into this so that we can compete. Because music is an expression of cultural power. So the majority is always going to want to be represented first. And so once you understand that, like I said, you know, hopefully that saves you from your psychotherapist bill. But it's not easy. Okay. Thank you very much.